Gather round, children. It's story time with your 80s slasher librarian. Today, Friday the 13th, Hell Lake, Chapter 2. In hell, there was only cold comfort. Wayne Sanchez had spent days, maybe weeks, exploring the desolate landscape that would be his prison throughout eternity. Time no longer had any meaning. If he'd wanted to spend most of his twilight existence roaming the dead, rocky wasteland, surveying each and every one of those tortured, hostile faces trapped alongside him in perpetual misery, then he could have done. They were always the same, and they were always different. Each one a portrait of internal violence, a monstrous ego clashing with the others who shared its mutual distrust of each and everyone else. Or perhaps it was hatred, an intense dislike verging on self-loathing. For even Sanchez, in all his self-glorification and mythologizing, realized they were trapped in the lowest circles of hell because their mortal souls had descended to the lowest level. They weren't there for violating any federal or state code. No other man had placed them there. Only themselves. Hell was only themselves. When a killer is able to rationalize his crimes, he is able to live with himself. When he perceives his atrocities through a gauze of moral equivalency, or warped memory, or even a kind of false heroism, it seems to be about something other than the pitiful, violated human shells and the wrecked lives that he leaves behind. This is for other people to deal with. Here in this place, it was impossible to avoid the angry glare of self-defeat. A condemned soul could exist for an eternity without seeing his own reflection in a rock pool. So arid was the dead landscape. But he could not escape the faces of all those other losers, their hatred and their moral cynicism, their violence and their mania, their brutal faces looming out of them semi-darkness, hating the other lost souls who gazed upon them for the same reason that they returned their hate, because they reminded them eternally of their own predicament, reminded them of how little regard they held for the other sufferers who, in the onlookers' eyes, probably deserved their fates, reminded them of how they themselves were no less deserving. There was little respite. In his first short taste of eternity, the devil boy had adjusted soon enough to the cries of the damned. After all, in his earthly existence, wailing sounds and cries of destruction and despair had been music to his ears. Here in the 13th circle, though, it was a permanent soundtrack, an echoing cacophony of screams, curses, wails, and moans of despair. One could adjust to it in the way that a factory worker adjusts to the sounds of industry. But a factory hand can go home, and this was home now, forever. Most of the lost and the condemned would have gone to any lengths to remove themselves, any lengths at all, as they were preserved in the corporal likeness of their earthly selves. They still essentially lived the life of the body, but a life deprived of food, drink, sleep, sex, or any form of pleasurable consolation at all. So it was that, to all appearances, the body could die, but never from natural causes or old age. If a condemned soul wanted to die, then it would have to be via self-destruction. It was not uncommon. Sanchez had already witnessed it several times, in the first short phase of his eternal tenure. "You shit-eating rat, you loathsome baby-raping maggot." It hardly mattered how accurate the screamed insults were. It was all a pretext for two desperate men, their souls brutalized beyond the point of madness, to rip and gouge and tear at each other. The country guy who sat on the rock, the only other being with whom Sanchez conversed, said it wasn't unknown for men and women to fight to the death. He remembered that, as he watched the two ugly guys, faces distorted with hate, try to destroy each other with their bare hands. He watched a listless crowd from around them to take in the only distraction they would ever find in this place. The spectacle of one man pushing his fingernails deep into another's eyes, until his right eyeball hung out on its stalk. The other fighting back by jamming his coarse, hardened thumb straight up into the soft flesh below his enemy's jaw, until the skin broke and his fingers were able to poke at the inside of his opponent's throat. Unexpectedly, regaining the upper hand by forcing the strangled man's head back onto the rocks, whereupon it was bludgeoned, cracked, dashed, not once or twice, but 11 or 12 times, until the back of his skull caved in, and the pop-eyed man forced his hand into the back of the bloody fracture, removing a gory mulch of cerebral tissue, forcing a piece of the dying man's brain into his own mouth, screaming, "Eat shit, shit for brains!" It was only by talking to the country sophisticated guy that Sanchez recognized the victor in a bout like that. And it wasn't the guy who'd go through eternity wearing his eyeball on his cheek. The winner was the guy who died. Maybe they didn't think of it like that. To them, their fight to the death was just an expression of rage that they had to make somehow, anyhow. But the guy who died was the only one who was getting out of here. It was a pretty short-term view. For where did the debased soul of those who had already descended into the lowest level go? Why, they went to hell, straight back to hell, returned to the lowest circle instantly. If a soul like Sanchez, never given to book learning, needed a perfect example of the futility of his predicament, then here it was. He came to confer with the guy on the rock. The other guy didn't look up, hardly ever looked up, but he knew he was there. His expression changed slightly, an alertness born of a sense of intrusion, or maybe of danger. There's got to be an end to this shit. Some way, somehow. I don't care if it means burning us all to ashes and flushing us down the can, man. There's got to be some way out. Mr. Sophisticated Redneck was unmoved and unmoving. He nodded his head slowly, with the complacency of someone with all the fight bled out of him. "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," he finally spoke, quoting Paradise Lost. It was not the kind of smug bullshit he needed to hear right now. "Oh, right. And who fucking reigns here, man? Who's the king, S.A.? You sitting there on your stone, throne, growing some hemorrhoids?" Sanchez was getting close to the stage when he would need to kill, or be killed, just to let out some of the craziness that was starting to fill his head. They had robbed him of the inspiration and guidance of his lord Satan, our master in evil mayhem. Even the preachers had promised him that the devil was real. Now he was shortchanged. There was no grandiosity in evil. There was no nobility in having the balls to transgress the moral order anymore. Sanchez wanted some hope in hell. If the Lord of Darkness didn't exist, then he wanted to instate one. Charles, which was the name of the man sitting on the rock, told the devil boy, that was his name, remained morose. They sometimes exchanged words when Sanchez fought his way over to the rock, where Mr. Sophisticated wasted away throughout eternity. But it always ended in despondency. It was true that the devil boy's company was more stimulation than he'd had in what seemed like a lifetime already, but, as with most of the lowlifes in this place, he couldn't regard him as an intellectual equal, and there was always something that returned him straight back to his wretched predicament. He'd come briefly alive when Sanchez finally placed him, from the news reports, as one of the last men to die in California's gas chamber. One of the last to vainly try to hold his breath over a bucket of cyanide before they replaced it with the so much more humane method of lethal injection. But the new face in hell had no idea as to the nature of his crime. It was altogether too refined, too subtle, to appeal to a random butcher and rapist like Sanchez. Charles Westenhaus was a downfallen rich boy, one of society's elite who had overreached himself to grab what, in his opinion, was rightfully his. He was even a near graduate of Harvard, a nearly was in terms of his family's business relations, who nearly set up an empire of his own, but squandered the collateral on fine living. A scion of the Polo Club, a coke-sniffing Lithero on the ski slopes of Aspen, a matricide case who might have beaten the rap if his mother had been some lower middle-class riffraff. He might have got away with it, had he not betrayed his brilliant scheme to slowly overdose his diabetic mother with insulin by faking ever larger prescriptions. He had taken up a previously unheeded calling when, denied his family's funds to pay legal costs, he fired the public defender as his attorney and represented himself. "Young man," the judge had told him on the day of sentencing, "with your fine grasp of criminal law, under any other circumstances it would have been a privilege to have had you in my courtroom. But we have other business to attend to." It didn't take much to remind him of all he had lost. In the days after he was sentenced to death, the judge's remarks had awakened a whole new fantasy world for him. He saw himself as a potential top-ranking attorney, pitched somewhere between the highest-paid alimony lawyers and the cast of L.A. Law. His new image of himself inspired him to study appellate law in his cell until way into the night, to fire off request after request to the Court of Appeal, all to no avail. His new vocation had come much too late to change the course of his life. It was much more depressing than ever to be reminded of his wasted potential as he sat on a rock in the lowest circle of hell. "Don't torment yourself, devil boy," Westinghouse sullenly mocked. "We're all up to our necks in the same shit." But the hot-tempered young psycho could not accept his fate, however rational it would have been to do so. "You talk like a loser, Charles." For once, Westinghouse's gaze lifted from the darkness of the middle distance, his meditation broken. This angel-dust-smoking berserker, this beast of the barrios, was calling him a loser? What exactly did Sanchez have in mind that was going to elevate him above the cesspit he was ensconced in? "Ever since I was a little kid, I used to daydream about what it must be like to rule over hell, S.A., to really be Satan. Think about it. All of the people locked down here, when you add them all up, there are more people that the straight world fears down here than there are in the entire world today. Pure fear. Someone could really make use of that." Well, he had a point. As a purely hypothetical exercise, Charles could see that the ability to inflict fear on a wide scale was highly useful. Immense fear could translate into immense power. But so what? It remained hypothetical to the point of impossibility. It didn't change their situation one iota. So, who will be the great usurper of darkness? Who takes control? You, devil boy? The mockery may have been too easy, but it was all he had. If he had to live out eternity with this Mexican marauder's crackpot fantasies, then Sanchez would have to endure his cynicism. No. The preppy was surprised to hear the devil boy climb down off his pedestal. "No, I got the ideas." He rapped his knuckles against his forehead with an unsparing ferocity. "But I ain't got the power. There is someone, though. One dude who could take charge of this whole fucking freak show." Oh. If this amounted to anything other than an addled fantasy, then Charles wanted to hear it. If not, he could go and find his own rock to dwell upon for the next 1,000 years. "You know about Jason?" "Jason? Jason who?" "Jason Voorhees, the Crystal Lake Killer, S.A. They used to say he was the killer that couldn't be killed." "Are you—" Charles couldn't stop the mocking grin spreading up from the corner of his mouth. "Are you talking about the malodorous retard in the mask? That thing couldn't take charge of its own senses, let alone any great mass of people." Well, yeah, that was who Wayne was talking about, except that he didn't see him that way. He knew the full story of Jason, all the legends and all the facts, down to the last drop of blood to be spilled, all of the murderous career that he had eluded law enforcement and defied the vengeful adolescent brats who had sought to drown, burn, shoot, and stab his hero. Jason Voorhees could never be beat. Jason always came back at you. Westinghouse didn't know shit. I have to say, devil boy, you really had me going for a moment. It was so easy to mock, so facile. All the same, Charles would drain the last drop of humiliation out of Sanchez that he could. Eternity was too long a time not to grab any last vestige of amusement. I thought we really were going to hear something approaching a master plan. I guess it's a little too much to expect from someone who spent their time on Earth smoking PCP and pretending to be the spawn of Beelzebub. You had better watch your fucking mouth, man. In his time on Earth, Wayne Sanchez had been treated like a celebrity on death row. True, in county jail before his sentencing, the gangs had given him shit and tried to punk him out. But that was because he stood as a man alone. Just him and his Lord Satan. He wasn't some whining sissy who fought with every legal trick and every clever word that he knew to try to prove he didn't kill his old mama. Westinghouse wasn't used to guys like him and Voorhees, to hellspawn, the real deal. One more sideways sneer out of this guy and Wayne would show him he didn't have the cojones to back it up. Then the shadow fell over them both. It appeared seemingly out of nowhere, and to any spider watching from a vantage point on its rock in hell, it would have seemed that both of these men were equally terrified, equally dumbstruck. But the masked behemoth, the malodorous retard that stood over them, only had eyes for Charles Westenhaus. Charles fell from his rock, the first time Sanchez had seen him dislodged since he arrived. It seemed as if he'd virtually forgotten how to use his legs, as Jason reached down one powerful arm, stinking foully of the rotten fabric that had long since meshed with the skin. He could only cower and look at the giant threat that lumbered over him, defenseless with no sarcastic words to hide behind this time. Jason placed one huge, rotting gloved hand under Westenhaus's jaw and wrenched him up into the air, almost eye to eye with the one watchful orb that could still be seen through the vertical opening of his mask. The Ivy League poisoner could only cringe and fight to conserve breath. Holding him effortlessly aloft by his throat, it seemed as if Jason was going to make Charles Westenhaus die all over again. Sanchez had been gripped by a terrible fear at first. He knew the potential of the Voorhees dude as a force of irrational violence. The two of them may have become like blood brothers, but he didn't see that anyone was beyond Jason's random wrathfulness. But now he was more impressed than ever. Westenhaus, the smug fuck, was choking on his own terror as much as he was having the life strangled out of him. In the time, maybe hours, maybe days, since Sanchez had left Jason to his own space and come back to speak with this preppy country know-it-all, he knew the masked killer had not followed him back. He had appeared at random, at will, out of nowhere, because his thoughts and the Devil Boy's were on the same wavelength somehow. Because he knew someone was bad-mouthing his fearsome name to his blood brother, Wayne Sanchez. That, Wayne decided, was real power. He wasn't sure how Jason had finally arrived in hell, giving the big guy's reputed ability to fight back against every injury ever inflicted. He felt sure they'd have to burn him alive and then set fire to his body's ashes to lay him down this low. But he also felt with a renewed conviction that nobody was going to be able to keep him here forever. Chapter 3. So what I got here is a triple murder committed out in the open. Just under a couple hundred potential witnesses, and not a single damn one of them that can tell me anything worth squat. Sheriff Casey's words were meant to accuse. Trey was indifferent to them. Fresh out of the holding cells, he knew that if the sheriff truly felt he was obstructing the investigation, he could charge him. But he didn't have any more evidence that anyone was refusing to cooperate than he did, that Trey had committed the murders. Not that it had prevented him holding the boy in custody for 3 nights, until his legal aid attorney, Miss Miranda, had absolutely insisted on his release. So I'm free to go? The meatloaf-faced deputy, Lloyd Spinks, shot a knowing idiot grin over to his boss, Casey. Shauna watched the bubbling confrontation intently. She had brought over her little Honda van to drive Trey back to the campus, and had to bite her tongue every time she smelled an abusive process. Why, son, you were always free to go. The faux geniality was underlined by unspoken menace, although after 3 days of enduring Casey's ignorant attempts at conducting a murder investigation, it was a minor improvement to be called son rather than boy. When we said we were inviting you to help with this inquiry, that's exactly what we meant. It just seemed you had a little more to tell us than your girlfriends here. He gestured over to Shauna and Gretchen without paying them much of a glance. Trey knew he would be accused of oversensitivity if he complained, but he felt the suggestion of a mixed-race relationship also got up Casey's nose. There was the plural, girlfriends, as if the black kid can't content himself with just one white girl. It was all unspoken, all unsaid. Maybe, he told himself at several junctures, he was becoming paranoid. But no white kid had been held in the cells when he was theoretically free to go. No one else had been questioned more than once about his gang affiliations, of which Trey held none. So you thought you'd better encourage my cooperation by locking me down without representation, is that right? Casey's wrinkled eyes showed the demeanor of a man set in his ways. A man who had successfully run for the position of sheriff of a small town several times, and didn't want to relinquish it before his retirement in a couple of years. a trusted and efficient local authority figure who would run for election for the final time on the platform of a curfew for wild, smart-ass kids like LeBlanc here. Casey looked serious. I told you several times during our informal interviews, if you feel your civil rights have been abused in any way, I can provide you and your attorney with the correct forms to describe the procedure for making a complaint. Otherwise, Mr. LeBlanc, you'll forgive me, but I have a particularly heinous multiple crime to investigate now. So heinous you spent 3 days sweating the young black man who reported the crime? By the time you guys get off your butts and do something, this creep will have more kills to his name than Bundy. Shauna had to let it come steaming out at one point, but Gretchen could feel the sheriff's ire building up, as her eyes determinedly swept the floor. For Casey, it was the last straw. Get your asses out of my office now, before I decide to bust you for insulting an officer of the law. He rose from his desk to emphasize his displeasure. If I hear any one of you doing anything to impede my investigation, if you cause a public nuisance by holding rave parties on public land, if any of my men catch you drinking liquor underage, or God help you, in the possession of narcotics, you can kiss that college education goodbye, because you'll be spending the next year in county. Have I made myself understood? They filed out in sullen silence. The LeBlanc kid and the feisty bitch Shauna Black. And wouldn't you know it, her given name was Brown. Now, what kind of issues did she have that she had to change the color of her surname? Gave off hate in waves. But they kept their mouths closed for once. That little Andrews girl stayed pretty quiet and respectful. It was a shame about her. She seemed a nice kid. But Casey didn't rate her chances in life if she kept hanging out with trash like her two friends there. But LeBlanc wasn't finished yet. He hung himself over the deputy's desk like they weren't going to get rid of him till he had some further satisfaction. I need to reclaim my property. Casey shot a bemused look at Spinks. Have you returned this gentleman all his possessions, Lloyd? Certainly have, George. Wallet, leather belt, steel comb? The deputy reeled it off in sing-song fashion. I don't mean that. The young man was quietly insistent. I mean my motorcycle. Is there a pound where I can collect it from? What kind of ID am I going to need? It wasn't the funniest line of them all that he had ever heard, but somehow it cracked Casey and his deputy up. For the first time that day, a little genuine mirth diffused the tension. Why, Mr. LeBlanc, Casey explained with a sudden overstated patience, I'm afraid that won't be possible. You see, your vehicle is now marked to be Exhibit A, once this case eventually comes to trial. He paused. And Exhibit B, and Exhibit C, and every goddamn case suffix up to Z-999, once they label up all the different parts, that is. Deputy Spinks laughed. It suddenly got through to Trey that not only would he not be seeing his beloved new Ninja anytime soon, but that he remained connected to the case by the use of one of its components, as the murder weapon that killed Josh Logan, his friend, the wigga that he tolerated while others cringed in embarrassment, the harmless stoner that Casey had accused Trey of hating after he referred to Josh as that poor kid. Contrary to what you may think, the sheriff used the opportunity to underline a point. We don't lock people up here for nothing. This is Forest Green in the 21st century, not Dixie in the 1950s. If Mr. LeBlanc here was unable to explain how or why his motorcycle was dissembled to obtain a murder weapon, then we had a duty to hold him in custody until the facts became clear. The facts being that he didn't do it, which you now understand, but you didn't know it before. It was that long streak of piss black bitch again. Where did she get off riding his dick? The facts being, Miss Brown, he stated pointedly, that we're not able to obtain any forensic readings from the murder weapon until it was sent to the crime lab in the north of the state for analysis. Mr. LeBlanc owes his current freedom to the fact that the report was a little, inconclusive, to say the least. Some prints were recovered from the other cycle components, but they're being sent for further analysis. The only match they could make is with an offender who's now deceased. But as far as I'm concerned, every student from the University of College Green who attended that illegal rave party remains a potential suspect. Everyone. George Casey was relieved to see them all go finally, even the LeBlanc kid. He'd known from some point late in the first day of questioning that it was unlikely they had their man. But with 3 sets of grieving families going after him, how could it have looked if he had released the only potential suspect with a definite material link to the crimes? There was still something he didn't like or trust about him, but he could apply that same reservation to most of the college kids interviewed in the days since the massacre. Either smart-ass or sullen, too drunk or stoned to tell him anything, or insistent that he listen to the whole bunch of crap he didn't want to hear. There was that Garcia kid who'd sworn he'd seen a big, menacing figure in a jumpsuit wearing a hockey mask entering the forest. Now, why exactly did he think the sheriff's office would want to listen to that one again? Just because a multiple homicide occurred in the vicinity of Crystal Lake? Garcia was ridiculous enough to kick up a stink when Casey had initially told Sphinx not to make a full report. But the boy was insistent, and his parents were big enough noises in the state of New York's Latin American community to have the whole thing transcribed word by heard it all before word. He thought he'd heard the last of those stupid boogeyman tales. It was true that Forest Green had an unusually high murder rate for a small town, if you added up all the sporadic outbreaks since the beginning of the 1980s. But then, if you worked out an average over all the years that the crime rate dipped straight back down again, you probably came up with something that, statistically, was about the same as a medium-sized suburban or industrial town. But it was the recurrence of the old fairy tales that bothered him. Casey had just taken over as sheriff when the last spate of freakish homicide incidents occurred, and he was deputized himself during one of the previous, perhaps one of the worst blips in the crime rate. And the refrain was always the same. The man in the mask, a big silent guy with a penchant for bladed weapons or industrial tools. By the time he joined the sheriff's office, there was even a name attached by the public to the eternally reoccurring suspect, Jason. Sometimes with the surname attached, but most often with the phony familiarity, just Jason. It seems the media had got a hold of the mystery surrounding the first of the massacres at some point in the past 2.5 decades, and built up several layers of bullshit around it. Feature writers, movie makers, even, he'd heard tell, comic book publishers, had built up a kind of Halloween tale around the idea of the killer at Crystal Lake. A big lummox who jumped up like the devil whenever a rash of unsolved murders occurred. If he was honest about it, George Casey had no idea why there should be a sudden outbreak of unsolved murders within the same small geographical area every few years. But it was probably no more than occurred in any other and many other modern American communities. Ever since the end of the 1950s, society had started to go to hell, and it was everybody's responsibility to make sure the pendulum swung back the other way again, toward a strong Christian society where every individual took responsibility for their own actions. But it was not helpful to blame things on the boogeyman. As far as the sheriff could see, some of these freak occurrences had ended as soon as they began, when some of the rotten kids involved had taken each other out. Who was to say who was the perpetrator and who was the victim under those circumstances, when there was no one left who could give a coherent account? Even the first massacre, back in the summer of '79, had been attributed to an unlikely suspect, a formerly respectable middle-aged woman named Pam Voorhees, who got whacked herself. The girl who killed her had been locked up in the nut house. So who was to say Mrs. Voorhees hadn't been a completely innocent victim? What with the drugs these kids were probably taking, it was downright offensive to him that the news and entertainment media should take the girl at her word, particularly when she claimed to be haunted by Mrs. Voorhees' son. That was the start of the real bullshit. Jason had been the Voorhees kid's name, and from that they extrapolated a totally unbelievable story that he'd been the perp behind every subsequent series of murders committed around Crystal Lake and Forest Green ever since, on a rampage to avenge his mom, or some such bullcrap. But the real clincher, for him, showed how media speculation had no part in law enforcement's work. Jason Voorhees had died in 1957 at the age of 11, drowned while at a summer camp on Crystal Lake, and this was the basis for the phantom that had supposedly stalked Forest Green ever since. Some skinny, little drowned, and by all accounts retarded, kid growing up as the big masked bozo that every fruitcake claimed to have seen, but no cop had been able to apprehend. It made him sick that some stupid people demanded he take these claims seriously. But it was also disconcerting that, whenever something like this took place, there were always inexplicable loose ends. Forensic tests on the discarded, bloodied bike chain had apparently ruled LeBlanc out of suspicion. The fingerprints were assuredly not his. In fact, it was hard to see how they could be anybody's. They had a curiously deformed quality that the crime lab could only compare to a corpse gradually losing its identifying characteristics. Casey had read about audacious offenders who had played tricks with their identifying characteristics, like partially obliterating their fingerprints with acid. But this wasn't one of those, so the lab had said. They compared it to a floater, a body that had been in the river long enough to decompose, its deterioration aided by the different chemical processes that would beset it in salt water rather than on dry land. Imagine if they heard that, he told himself. To all the freaks and occult nutbags, it would be proof that the killer was the Voorhees kid, resurrected from his watery grave after nearly half a century. It didn't bear thinking about. The phones were constantly blurting across the small network of one main office and two annexes. Since the sheriff had spent the last 3 days preoccupied by a fruitless interrogation, the other deputies had been sent out to try to coordinate with a flying visit by a two-man team from the FBI's office in Quantico. Casey's secretary, Brenda, with the help of Lloyd, were fielding the various calls over endless styrofoam cups of coffee. Their brief was to approach Casey directly only if a call demanded something beyond the administrative or PR level. When Lloyd Spinks fielded the call from the Delaware State Police Department, he passed it to his superior with a sense of regret. Never did a sheriff's deputy have a greater sense that he was not the organ grinder, but only his monkey. Casey took the call. His craggy, gray-browed face, normally so slow to show expression, became almost animated when he reacted to the news down the line. "Sure, this is he. Who am I speaking to?" After a pause. "Uh-huh. Oh, really? And what apparent connection does there appear to be?" A further long pause. His formerly matter-of-fact responses became more serious, more measured in their tone. "I see. That would appear to be pretty conclusive. Yeah, I see. Yeah, well, thanks for keeping me informed. Yep, that's fine. I can be reached on this number, or my deputy will give you my cell. Okay, bye-bye now." He answered Deputy Spink's inquisitive look. "Well, Lloyd, looks like there's a series of 'em now." He was almost gleefully inappropriate in his response, as if this was the best news he'd had all week. "Thing is, this latest one's got the same markings cut into him as the Logan boy. That's not something we've gone public on. Nobody's going to know that. Thing is, this one's 2 county lines away. It's outside our jurisdiction. Looks like this sucker is making tracks." It was indeed the best news he'd heard that day. On an adjoining 2-lane road, off the Ocean Highway, all local traffic was diverted around the Tate police cordon. Lying face down on his belly, the partially covered body of a muscular young man had now been there so long as to risk the onset of decomposition. There would be further forensic and pathological examination once they took him back to the lab. For now, it would suffice to know his distraught family said he had been driving a red, white, and blue sprayed Ford pickup truck that appeared to have been taken by the perp, and all points alert had been sent out to state police with jurisdiction for the Delaware section of Highway 130. Of course, there was no way of knowing whether this freak was staying within state lines. As soon as he crossed, this became a federal case, and the FBI assumed overall responsibility. While none of the Delaware police were as cock-a-hoop as Sheriff Casey, not having an imminent re-election campaign to consider, their responses were divided between resentment at the feds, likely takeover, and relief. For this character was a freaky one. You only had to look at the deceased, one James W. Randall, to see what a fight he'd put up. According to preliminary forensic examination, It appeared that blood drops running up and down the asphalt were an indication the victim had at first been wounded by the perpetrator inside the vehicle, then given chase. Their sudden about turn and the fact that the droplets grew heavier and more frequent, as if from multiple wounds, suggested the perp had suddenly given more than he was taking. Jim Randall, a tall, toned amateur bodybuilder, had suddenly taken flight from the attacker he'd at first been angry enough to believe he could beat. Going by the size and frequency of the second set of droplets, investigating detectives believed he couldn't have taken another 4, maximum 5 steps back to the driver's seat before succumbing to loss of blood and possible internal organ injuries. Then the killer's real work had begun. Besides severing the victim's carotid artery, and most likely causing the bleeding that led to death, he'd got to work on a large, biker-style tattoo that covered Randall's back. It stretched from his lower shoulder to the small section of flesh at the bottom of his spine. Jesus and crucifixion, inflicted with stigmata, and the Roman soldier's lance in his side. His suffering was gaudy and colorful, though there was nothing mocking or sadistic about its tone. The tattoo looked like it had been taken from the walls of one of the most devout Latin Catholic churches. It was a fitting pledge of devotion from a former 3-time offender who had reformed since finding Christ. But the killer, like some sacrilegious graffitiist, had defaced his body's artwork, cut around the outline of Christ's suffering, in knife wounds that had no chance to congeal or form scabs before the victim died, were a series of gruesomely carved triangular points. It was clumsily done, as if the killer had no draftsman's hand for such a large, fleshy canvas, or, most probably, that the victim was still alive as the killer tried to make his mark. Not everyone was sure, but one of the feds who claimed to have an awareness of occult crime said that the 5 triangular points were connected as a pentagram, the ritual worship sign of the devil, the same symbol that was carved, less messily, into the fleshy butt of the Logan boy, back in Forest Green. Okay, this concludes story time with the 80s Slasher Librarian for today. Hope you've enjoyed chapters 2 and 3 of Friday the 13th Hell Lake. I'll be back on Tuesday with more chapters of Hell Lake, and I'll be back tomorrow with more chapters of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Protégé. Until next time, this has been your 80s Slasher Librarian saying, thanks for listening. See you next time.